Okay, hello everyone. So today, this lecture, we're going to be going over the 12 principles of animation. So here are the 12 principles. You can pause to take a look at all 12 of them, but I'll be having slides that combine two or three of them together, uh, just to go over them really quickly. So first, we have squash, stretch, plus anticipation. So these two concepts, they all place emphasis on motion. So squash and stretch, this is talking about the literal deformation of the image. So for example, if you have a character jumping, you would literally stretch them out to sort of have this exaggeration on their body to make the effect of jumping much more apparent. And now a key point to this sort of deformation is that you want to maintain the same volume as the image had before. And in this way, when you're animating with your frames, the frames won't look inconsistent from previous frames of the image. And in this way, it makes it look much more natural. And for anticipation, this is referring to animating so that you have a certain movement that signifies the main movement. So for example, if you have, let's say, this fox over here jumping, you would animate him sort of backing up before doing the actual jump. And in this way, the audience can anticipate for the actual action, and then this makes the jump feel much more natural rather than sudden. Now, the next part is staging. So, staging refers mostly to scenic animations, and this is referring to the layout of your scene. So, it's important to have a balanced scene. For example, we'll take this scene from the TV show Mr. Bean. You can see that the main character, Mr. Bean, is on the left side. He's extremely big and takes up around a third of the space. Now, usually you want the main focus to take up around the thirds of the screen or even in the center. And this way, you sort of have the spotlight focusing on the main object that you want the audience to look at. And this is what they're doing here. And next, if you're going to have supporting characters or supporting environmental objects, it's best to put them it's best to make them small and sort of put them on the side, as you can see over here. You have a beach full of people, but as you can see, the people are all relatively small and lacking in detail. And they're also put on the far right, which is opposite of Mr. Bean. In this way, these secondary characters all feels like supporting background and doesn't impede on Mr. Bean's presence. And in a way, they also act as a balance to Mr. Bean's location on the screen, creating this balanced scene. And it's also important to note that a good way to test if your scene is good is to see if any characters are fighting for spotlight. And you'll usually tell when you show a scene to someone and they can't answer what the main point of the scene is. And that would usually mean that you have two things that are competing for the main attention. Now, this part we're going to go over straight ahead and pose to pose. And this is referring to different animation techniques. So straight ahead is talking about drawing each frame of an animation consecutively. When you're trying to animate a character or a figure, this is usually not recommended because by drawing each frame consecutively, you usually don't know what the end result or the end pose of your character is. And as a result, you usually have a lot of errors and also time errors in motion as well as errors in timing. And so you'll have to go back and fix a lot of these things. Usually, straight ahead animation is better suited for things like visual effects. For example, like a flickering flame. You can usually animate the little flame on top flickering and animate the flickering through straight ahead techniques. However, for pose to pose, this is best for figures and for animating people. And this is because you're able to sort of plan out your animation ahead. So what this means is that you pick out the extremes of your animation and then you sort of fill in the gaps in between to lead up to those certain poses. Hence it's called pose to pose. So here are some examples. So over here, if I were to do straight ahead, I would literally draw each frame one by one until I reach the desired effect in the end. Now over here, if I were doing pose to pose, I would pick each of these sort of extremes and then draw in the things in between like this. In this way, you can get both the same effect, although it's just different ways of going about it. Now, next is follow through and overlapping action. So this is mainly talking about drag and sort of the physics behind the motion when you're doing animations. So when you have characters with movable parts, a single motion will usually cause other parts to move along with it, but these secondary motions usually have a delay. And so this is called overlapping action. For example, over here we have a ball that is moving from right to left, and there's a little wire. But notice how the ball moves, and the tip of the wire sort of stays behind and moves only after the ball has moved. And this overlapping action gives a sense of asynchronization, doesn't make the movement feel too unnatural. And the next is follow through, and this is talking about the wire in the aftermath of the movement. So you can see that the ball is stopping suddenly, but the little wire sort of goes on and sort of springs ahead before springing back into resting position. In this way, this sort of gives off a feeling of physics, like the motion is pushing past its stopping point and then sort of going back to stability. And through these techniques, you'll make your animations feel less sudden and less chunky and more natural. Now we're going to be talking about slow in and out plus arcs. So slowing in and out, an example for this will be on the next slide. Slowing in and out refers to speed of your animation, not being constant. And basically you want to show a sort of acceleration rather than a flat motion. And in this way, this again helps smooth out your animations. For example, if you have a person running, you don't want them to start running at a constant pace. You want to have this little buildup before reaching a high speed and then maybe slowing down near the end. And by doing this, in order to do this, usually draw more frames in the beginning, which will slow down the action, and then draw less frames near the middle to sort of speed it up. And then drawing more frames again to have it slow down for a final end to the motion. For arcs, this is referring to mostly characters and animating things around characters. If you have characters using their arms and legs, you want to make sure to draw a lot of arcs around their bodies when they're using these appendages. And this is because you want to build a sense of space and that the character is the center of all motions that are stemming from them. So over here, you can see you have this character swinging a bat. The bat obviously is going to arc around their body. It's not going to randomly go from left to right horizontally and straight. There's a certain, it's sort of tied to the character itself, and you can tell through the arcing of the motion. So over here, this is a ball moving from left to right, back and forth bouncing, and this is at a constant pace. So it's moving the same frames at a constant rate from left to right, or same units of movement. Now here is if the ball is animated with acceleration, essentially. So you can see that it sort of slows down and then starts up when it's going from back and forth. And you can see that it feels much more smoother as opposed to this. Now, of course, these are suggestions. If you have an animation that wants to have this sort of constant motion, then obviously go for it. But generally, the acceleration will feel much more smoother in the eyes of a viewer. Now, next is secondary action timing. Now, I mentioned secondary action before, and this is sort of talking a little bit more about secondary action overlapping with the primary action. So when you're animating two things at the same time, you want to animate the primary action first in order to get a sort of center motion and have anything that will respond to that center motion afterwards and sort of layer them on top. For example, over here, you have the fox jumping. And now the whole point, the main action of this fox is the jumping motion. So my primary action would be to get the legs correct. So I would animate the legs separately, the legs and the body. And then afterwards, I would connect the head and the tail with their respective animations onto it afterwards. And then combine those together, you get this full jumping motion with the fox's entire body moving. Now timing is referring to the speed of your animation. So we've talked about this a little bit before, and basically more frames means that the speed of your animation will be slower because your animation will be running at a certain frame rate, And so by having more frames, it's going to go through more frames in the same amount of time, and it's going to be slower. As opposed to having less frames, it's going to be going over less frames, and so things will seem much more faster. Now, usually, another key point with timing is that you don't want secondary actions to move in sync with the main. And the reason for this is you want to create much more natural actions, because in real life, we don't all move like robots and nothing really moves simultaneously. And so you want to create a bit of asynchronization in order to make things feel much better when viewing them. And now exaggeration. So exaggeration is pretty important in animation and especially important in video game making. And the reason for this is because depending on your game, your character may be very small or very big. And the joys of video games are being able to look at your character. So for example, over here we have Hades. The character of Hades, he's relatively small. And so as a result, you want to have a lot of exaggerated actions in order to better communicate that he's performing a certain action. If he wasn't exaggerated, it would be very hard to tell what he's even doing in the first place. So over here you can see that the way he's throwing his spear, it's extremely exaggerated. He's using his full body to just toss that spear. And because of this, even in the middle of all the special effects and action, you can clearly tell what he's doing. And now, finally, one of the last things about animation is having a solid drawing and appeal. So this is talking about how even if you're really good at animating and creating motion, you have to make sure that your character is good to look at in the first place. In this way, you want viewers to sort of feel a connection with your character and want to see your character in motion so that your animations will pay off. And obviously, your animations will also play a part in building up the character that you've created. And so here are some iconic characters like Hollow Knight and Mario. And these characters have their own little appeal just visually by themselves. And so by being appealing in that way, people are more likely to want to watch them move around and such in the video game. And yeah, so those are the 12 principles. Now for activities in class, we'll be going over this animation as well as this animation. And basically, we're going to be asking students to identify which of the 12 principles are being expressed in these two animations. Now, not all 12 principles will be expressed, but it's just an exercise to see if you can identify some of the things you've learned. And yeah, that's about it.